Okay, so this is a start of our installation procedure on this Tranquility synthetic flooring material. This is actually kind of good stuff. It looks like the wood or the Pergo, but it's actually a polymer. Okay, I think it's got some wood filler in it. You can see how it's flexible. It's got about a 0.5 millimeter thick wear surface, which as far as laminate flooring goes, is actually not bad, because that means you've got a little bit of wear surface where it's going to maintain some color. They've also done a pretty good job of making it look like wood. We're going to be installing it on a concrete floor that previously had carpet. As we've been able to sweep this off and see it, we're obviously at the ground level on this concrete floor. Although in apartment buildings you could deal with them at a higher level. Upper floors can still have concrete on larger buildings. But what we're doing is we're having to remove carpet edge strip that has been nailed, probably some sort of a power tool. You wouldn't be able to do that by hand. And the little davits you see were, where there have been nails. We have to pry those out. So prep on the floor is that the floor needs to be flat. And then there is a moisture barrier padding that goes in there. Now, I was having some discussions with the owners here who didn't want to use a moisture barrier padding because they wanted to save money. And basically the people at the place that sells this stuff helped me win the argument that, yeah, you really need to use something in addition to that. So it's a very thin flooring, but you need to use something else. And this was the stuff that they recommend. Comes from Lumber Liquidators. I think it's a little bit more money than what you would normally get at Home Depot, but it's what they were recommending for this polymer laminate flooring. And you'll see that it's a little bit thicker, a little bit heavier than the lightweight foam stuff, for example, that we've been using on the IKEA floor system that's in another one of my videos. This has kind of a shiny side and a dull side. And when we install this, we're going to be installing it where the shiny side is up. That means it's going to act as a little bit more of a moisture barrier both ways. The other thing I really like this material for is if water spills on it, liquid spills on it, the dog pees on it, whatever, that it's not going to start deteriorating right away the way Pergo does. And I think back to a dishwasher change out that I did a few years ago where we had an issue with that. Padding down, it's not a precision instrument, so if we're off the walls a little bit, that's fine. We trim a little bit to fit in that stuff. And if possible, kind of let it settle on the floor and flatten itself out before you're putting everything on. It's not the end of the world if you don't. The other thing you got to look out for is this particular stuff is a little bit on the thin side. So, if you need to go over the floor again to get the debris up, consider that a little bit of additional work on that, not majorly so. And I think what I'm going to do to get some of this stuff out of the cracks is we're going to have a vacuum cleaner handy for that, because the broom sometimes it's just not pushing it around and not getting it up. The other thing we're going to run into is all of these pieces are obviously a uniform length. And so we have to make sure that the seams on our stuff end up not lined up with each other, so it's not like a big checkerboard grid on the floor. The other thing we've got to look out for is that there are repeat pieces on these. They look like wood, but it's not real wood. Therefore, they're only going to make a finite number of wood look patterns on these. So every so many of these, we're going to figure out that there's going to be a repeat of, we just don't want two pieces next to each other to have, let's say, the knots in the same place. A couple of ways we can handle the spacing. One is we cut these things in half. We figure out our halfway point, we cut them in half, right? The other thing we can do is we cut them in thirds, and then we end up with something that looks a lot more natural. However, when we do that, we're wasting a little bit more of the material. So it's, it gets like that. We're not going to be cutting partials all the way down, so obviously, you know, there gets to be a pattern one way or another. Another way you can do that is you can cut semi-random lengths on these things and then save those other pieces because you're going to be using them at the other end on a course. And as you build out from another side, you can do that. So I'm going to go with the random length cuts, and then I'm going to save the other pieces for whenever I need short pieces at the other end. What we can't do is put random length cuts in the middle because we can't repeat this pattern. This cutting pattern was die cut at the factory. We can't repeat that with our hand tools or even some bench top tools. That's either done at the factory or not done at the factory. And if we get too crazy about trying to cut random patterns on this, we start burning through more material. And for a 525 square foot place, we've estimated a little under 10% waste on this. So we're pretty efficient at putting this stuff together, and I'm going to be cutting it close as far as having leftover materials on it. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut some of these kind of at random lengths, but I'm not going to go crazy about it. You don't pre-make a whole room worth of random lengths on these. You just do a few so you can get started. Okay, so in laying a first course, this is a pretty narrow room. So I'm not even able to get it to be 3 pieces wide, even with the first one cut in half. What I run into is I make the end of a wall here. Laying these edges is really easy on the first one because we can just kind of tilt one up and then wedge it down. And what we need to do though is, you know, this one's too long, right? You see how that goes? I've got the lip set here. We need that exposed, not the little lip, but the big one. Because otherwise, if you flip it around like this and you're trying to lay them from that direction, it's a lot harder. So what happens when we cut it, you know, obviously we can't get one in here and get everything to line up. We don't cut it here, but we do measure it here to get that in. And we've got a little room, a little fudge factor. There's going to be some quarter round here. So there's a little fudge factor to deal with, a little crap in the wall. But if we come in a little short, that's okay. I'm going to put this in a little long or kind of even there. I'm probably going to have to reach in with a tool and just kind of dig out that little bit of cement or plaster or whatever that crap is. Over here, I'm not going to worry so much about trying to get a direct straight line all the way across this, you know, like using let's say a carpenter square or something like that. All I need is a little knife notch here that gives me an indication of where my chop saw is going to start, because the chop saw is set to cut square and straight. Now, if you're cutting this stuff with a hand saw, then yeah, you probably do need to get yourself a line that goes all the way across. That's kind of your choice. I'm a little better equipped, so I don't have to worry about that. But this plastic seems to do pretty well with a fine-tooth saw. I had purchased a new saw for the chop saw before coming in here today because I expected that it would kind of throw splinters and have problems the way it does with regular Pergo. And with you try to cut Pergo with a dull blade, you end up with problems. So I bought a new fine-tooth carbide, about a $30 blade. Turned out I'm really not going to need it. I can use the old blade, which is also a fine-tooth carbide. It was just getting a little worn. And the older, slightly dull fine-tooth carbide seems to do pretty well with cutting this stuff. Doesn't seem to have a problem. What it will do though, and why I had to move it, it throws a lot of crap around. And this was a freshly painted wall, so we're taking that whole operation outside and doing it outside. Too much background noise out there for me to narrate the video out there. So we're going to cut this, bring it back in, and show how that relatively important first course goes in the first room. Obviously, straightness and squareness here is a function of the saw. This is definitely not a high-end chop saw, right? But a lot of times with these Harbor Freight tools, if it's plug-in-hole stuff, it's okay. It's not that bad. And big trick is to upgrade the blade. So that's it. It's the fine tooth carbide blade. Getting a little old for some other stuff, but it seems to do just fine for this. So you get a good smooth cut. This little miscut here. But when this gets installed somewhere else, remember how I was talking about using random cut pieces on ends? Well, this we're going to turn around and use on another end, see? And that's one of the ways we get our random cut stuff, is by taking it off the other side of the room when a piece came up short. The issue, though, is that you can't use the same pieces every time, or else you end up with that pattern that you really don't want. So, you know, if we're just using this piece on the other end of that board, then it's not going to look good. And so, you know, we still kind of end up with a little pack rat pile of these random cut pieces, which we may or may not use at the beginning of a course. On this one, I'm going to try and use it. So it just, you have to look out for it. And on this room, I've only got 2 courses before I'm reaching into the closet, and I have to do things at a different length anyway. In that corner, we get this in. Now sliding these sections together is tough, because this stuff is like a little bit tricky, and it's a little sticky, tricky type stuff, which is great for not developing cracks later on. It just makes insulation a little tricky. But at least when you're laying a first course, you can flex this stuff to flex that up, and then we flex it, we close that gap, and then we let it down. Now, if it happens to be you feel anything under here, like here, it turns out there was another nail head from the carpet strip. I'm going to pull that back and undo that. That gets to be an issue if you find any in the middle of the floor. But fortunately, the way this floor was installed originally with a carpet, we're only going to bump into that on the edges. The next row ready to lay in. It looks like I'm going to get about 3 rows before I'm running into this closet. I make the first row ahead of time just to make sure I'm going to fit okay. Now, if this stuff wasn't quite as flexible, I would try to just lift this up and angle it in all at once. This situation is not going to work that way, but if you have multiple people helping you out, you can do that, because setting these in where you lift up one edge, you're kind of pushing it in so that you've got full contact as you lower that, and make sure that it's not throwing off forward or backward. You know, we're guaranteed to have a good seam there, and then you can set the whole thing in place. On this situation, because it's so flexible, it's a little tricky to do that. And what we were warned about at the store is, you know, normally what you've got to do is you got to set a corner and then slide this in, and the last one's always a bugger because you still have to lift it up and get it into this thing. So the last one on a course on this stuff's usually kind of a bugger, but it gets to be a problem when you're doing the corners on these things. But the next course is in. Not all that difficult to wrestle this stuff in. The big benefit is that it's flexible, and that's why I'm really growing to like this stuff. It's flexible, so the only other thing you really got to look out for is making sure you don't repeat boards next to each other. But if you do make that mistake, it doesn't seem to show all that badly either. So the other thing I'm noticing is that a couple of these are actually the same pattern, just turned around in reverse. So we're going to look out for that, because like right here, these two ended up being the same pattern, turned around in reverse. Not the end of the world. I mean, it's a rental unit. So we're gonna look good, and then because you're using the pieces that are trimmed off of one end to start the next end, usually you can afford to start it with a whole piece every once in a while. Not the end of the world, and that's why I highly recommend doing the randomness on these things. So it looks a little bit more like a natural wood floor, and camouflages the fact that your raw pieces actually came all the same length. And on shorter rooms, what you end up with is you end up on cut pieces on both sides most of the time anyway, and it helps fix the overall look of it. You cannot do cut pieces in the center. So if anybody wants to do cut pieces in the center, that's not going to happen. But we can do it on the ends, and we can help randomize the pattern. And it ends up being a pretty good looking, long lasting floor. Here in a rental unit, really good like that. I think this guy is going to be able to, go through a couple of renters without a whole lot of damage being done to it. On my off-grid stuff, which you might see as a subject in my other videos, I really like this stuff for the off-grid survival retreat. I'm probably, I think some of the leftovers from this are going to end up on that, but I'll probably end up having to buy some boxes because we're a little bit tight on the overage that we calculated for this stuff. So this is also going to work with I'm going to cross-reference this with some of the stuff on the off-grid cabin construction, because this material is going to do really well if it goes long periods of time without being temperature controlled. Or let's say you spill water on it, you've got an off-grid situation, you're kind of rationing cleaning supplies and all that because everything has to be hauled in. It's not as immediate of a problem to have to deal with. So, and obviously you would never ever carpet a off-grid place. And what we're finding here in Portland, Oregon, you really don't want to carpet rentals. Most of the rental property owners these days are really wanting to shy away from carpet. The rents here are going to be lower than a lot of other places, and so even if they do keep the deposit when somebody screws the place up and moves out, it's not enough money to cover recarpeting after every turnover, after every apartment turnover. But this stuff is going to last through a few without having all those arguments over who screwed up the carpet. Okay, so we've got this room pretty close to done, and it looks really good. I'm really happy with this type of material. This Tranquility, kind of a synthetic laminate stuff. It comes in good. It's the only thing missing from this, as far as a good wearing wood look floor, is the wood smell. Okay, got a little bit of a vinyl smell to it, not much. And one thing we have to look at when we do this is it's a floating floor. And the way this place had carpet, and we didn't pull the trim out to redo this, it's possible that by walking around on the floor, especially when it's partially done, you can kind of accidentally or through wear kind of undo that little Lego pattern on these things as they were snapped together. It's not that bad, but if you get a gap somewhere in the middle of the floor, there's no undoing it. I mean, that just you got to live with it. The good news is that because this stuff is more or less impervious to liquids, it's not something that's going to turn into a real bad problem the way it does with the cardboard and pulp paste laminate flooring. The other thing we have to look at is that these all come in uniform lengths, and you cannot cut the type of dovetail they do on these. You can't do that with a hand tool. I don't even know where to buy a tool that does that. So that's factory made only, which means if you're going to do custom lengths on this, they all pretty much have to be at the ends. And in the way they snap together, it's not always a precision thing. That's why we will use quarter round trim on a lot of this. The tricky stuff when it comes to complex corners is getting a good match. And because this stuff has to be moved into place, it's not quite the same as dealing with wood flooring. You've got to be able to tilt that into place. We can't just cut away the tongue and groove and then set it straight down to have a tight fit. Could we have done that a little bit tighter on there? Possibly, but I'm not going to. Okay, I'm going to put quarter round on there and then go up to the edges, but I'm not going to obsess over that. The same as, let's say the backs of appliances or something like that. Just hopefully you don't end up with those types of things. Anytime when you end up with these corners and stuff, that's where square footage bidding is going to assume that you've got some of that to deal with, but not everywhere. Okay, and if it's a really complex floor with a lot of corners, a lot of turns, let's say hallways or something like that, it's appropriate to do an upward departure from square footage bidding. If you've got a large square expanse in the place, like this, where it's a large, relatively square expanse, you may be able to do a little downward adjustment on square footage bidding. Okay, a large dance floor or something like that, maybe a retail showroom or just a large flat area, you could probably go below normal square footage bidding. And what happens in a situation like this is we just kind of, it gets averaged out between the easy rooms and the hard rooms. One thing to understand on relatively narrow rooms is that when you have uniform width on the material, and you can't recut the ends, and we're trying to make it where the ends don't always line up, we want it to have that randomness look that you get with regular wood. We're only able to cut custom lengths on each side. The centers are the same length, but we can get the seams to look relatively consistent with each other without it just being like a straight row down the center, which is what you really want to avoid. You also want to avoid that if anything starts to separate, that separation doesn't carry very far. And so that's pretty much it, the Tranquility flooring. I could maybe do a walkthrough when this is totally done and add it to the end of the video. So this is a Tranquility flooring in another room. We're getting closer to done. This almost never goes on top of carpet, but here we're putting it on top of concrete. It can also be put on wood. The trimming on something like this is, I would say about medium. But remember that it has to move into place. We can't just simply cut away all the dovetails and then slide it straight up against something. So when clearance cuts are made for, let's say, details like these corners, I have to take into account that this thing has to be moved and snapped into place, and I have to have a little clearance for that. There are some ways to deal with that where you put a seam in the middle of the obstacle, but sometimes that works better than others. So on these, we've got a little gappage. We're still going to put quarter round on here, so if you have gappage in the corners, you just simply have a margin of error that's equal to whatever the width of that quarter round is. When you start getting to the doors, it's a little trickier. And on this, it's going to take a little bit of playing around with the trim to get it to work, to get it to look decent. But again, this is going to be something that's on the inside of a closet by the time we put the closet doors back on. Something's inside or under a closet area, I just don't think is going to be as critical. But you also have to look at what the demand and tolerance levels are on the client's expectations, and of course what they're paying. Because in really high-end flooring, I've seen it where the flooring from room to room it's consistent, it meshes. So what they might do here is move outward into this room, and then all of those pieces are going to consistently mesh into, let's say, the next room, and all the widths come out that way. On an application like this, the thing we have to realize is we cannot cut the dovetails that are in this snap together flooring. That's done at the factory. Nobody sells a tool bit or a blade for that. When I've done regular wood flooring and I have a situation where we're transitioning between rooms and we're not going to use any kind of a trim or transition piece to make up that gap between the rooms, what I can do is I'll make a single custom piece of the flooring out of the wood where I'm cutting a new dovetail in it, I'm cutting a new groove in the other end of it, and it ends up being a little bit wider or narrower, usually narrower, than the other pieces. We can't do that with this material. So what we're going to do is we build from room to room, with our pieces on the thresholds, and then we just use this edge trim. Edge trim ends up under a door. It will end up at some point under the door, give or minus a little bit, depending on where we're starting the other stuff on this other wall. And because of the way this stuff works, we generally have to start in a left side corner and then work backward. That's because of the way the grooves and the notches on this stuff work. So in this room, we would have two choices. One, we start in a left side corner over here, or we start in a left side corner over here in order to keep our lay relatively consistent with the two bedrooms that were done. In doing that, I'll show pictures when it's done, but also realize that in narrow rooms, we're only capable of trimming width on these. They're all uniform width. We can trim that on both ends. On one end, we have a decision to make on how wide we're going to make the starting course so that we can randomize where the gaps are. On the end, it's just kind of wherever it ends up. So when I have a piece left, we turn it around the other way, just do the knife notch thing, cut it, and stick it in there. And so there's a margin of error over here, which is still, that's actually determined by what kind of quarter round trim you're going to use. And yes, you can do this without the quarter round, but it's the way it's done is with the quarter round. The other way it would be done is to tear up the edge trim on the walls and then reinstall it right, like snug into the flooring. When I have a discussion with a client on something like that, they usually want everything possible included on the fixed price piece rate that they've determined. They don't want to deal with a bid that's based on hours. They want to determine a piece rate. And if they're talking about tearing out the trim and putting that in because they don't want to pay for the material, they just want you to add work, that's when you have to be prepared to walk away from the job. And because doing that way, at no extra charge to the client, it's going to take your job, and it's going to mean you're fixing walls. It's going to mean you're dealing with a lot of unpredictable stuff on where the nails were and all of that, and it's going to turn this thing into a nightmare. And what we're doing here is we're going to custom paint this. We're going to custom paint it brown so that it goes with the flooring. Normally you'd like to try and buy that stuff to do that, but in our situation we're not. And here, the way this floor ended up, you could almost live without the quarter round trim. But on the edge, the back edges, starting edges, you do want to do it just to keep the stuff from shifting around. Things about reaching this kind of end, you have to leave room for movement, for snapping this piece down. And then to get that last gap covered, what you do, use a small pry bar, in this case this one, and we just kind of gently pop all of that into place. And what you have to make sure is that when you've done that, you didn't just spread that gap out so far that the quarter round is incapable of covering it up. So fortunately, the quarter round does not cover this up. It's still going to work. We're going to be okay. But that's how you end a course on this. It had to be trimmed to a narrower length. There was a little bit of an off-center situation. I don't know if it was a room or the lay of the stuff. So we trimmed a little bit wider at one end than the other, which is actually pretty normal. So that's the the last touch on that before we get to the quarter round.